Good morning, ladies. Hi, Maria, and hello, Catherine. It's very nice to see you today.
Hi, nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, Maya.
Maria, we've already met before, and it's always nice to have you as a guest. But Catherine, this is my first time meeting you, and I'm very thrilled. It's a very nice discovery. I met you obviously through Maria, but it's very nice to meet you and to discover your personality, your energy, and your work. And actually, today I'm interviewing both of you because of a common project that both of you are working on together. It's really exciting. I'm very excited about it, and I wanted to share the news about this upcoming documentary that you have. Before we start talking about your documentary, though, I would want you to introduce yourselves,
Sure.
each one. So maybe Catherine, we can start with you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me. The so my name's Catherine Legge, and I'm a filmmaker, journalist, investigative journalist, producer, director, executive producer, and I have been in the media about 30 years now and come up through, really informational, investigative work into documentary, and it's a passion of mine and always as a young journalist, sort of the pinnacle of work that you could do for most of my career was that you would work on a case and be able to expose a wrongful conviction or work on, something that you were able to bring new information to an old case or an unsolved case. And so I have done that a few times and have had moments of doing that, and that's what brought me to this project. And in this project, I'm the producer and the director. I made it through my production company, Play Nice Productions, and it's been a passion project of mine that I've been working on since early 2024, but actually started many years before that.
Nice. And we'll be talking shortly about this project because Maria is also involved in it. So, Maria, if you can introduce yourself.
Certainly. Good morning. It's always nice to be with both of you. I place you on very high regard, so it's an honor for me to be part of this today. My name is Maria Shepherd. I'm a licensed paralegal, and as well, for those who don't know, I am one of Canada's wrongly convicted, who was assisted by AIDWIC, now known as Innocence Canada. I have steadfastly remained a staunch advocate against wrongful convictions in Canada, so I'm honored to be able to assist in any way, and I'm honored, Catherine, that you included me in this project.
So let's talk then about the project. It's a documentary. What's the name of the documentary, Catherine and Maria?
So the documentary is called The Murder That Never Happened. And that's a very literal name, and that's on purpose because a lot of true crime projects want to leave some ambiguity for the viewer to understand, especially in a wrongful conviction. Did he, didn't he? If he didn't, who did? All of those kind of regular questions. And I wanted this one because it is a wrongful conviction, and the person at the center of it is on death row. I wanted it to be very clear from the get-go that this film isn't about a did he, didn't he? It's how did things go so wrong? And so the film, is about a man who's on death row in Louisiana, and how myself, a Canadian journalist, comes into contact with him, and he is facing the opportunity after 32 years incarcerated and 27 on death row. He's being given the opportunity to prove his innocence. And he has this evidentiary hearing coming up, and he, enlists my help to try to get the truth out about his case because he's got two very pressing concerns, stakes that are life and death, literally, that he, one, believes that there are people who don't want the truth to get out, and so he could be harmed in his cell, killed, a hit taken out on him, other things happen to him while he's in vulnerable and in prison on death row. And the other is that he is concerned that Louisiana at the time we started talking about this, decided they wanted to resume executions after a near 20-year moratorium on executing people. The governor who was elected the same day Jimmy Duncan was granted an evidentiary hearing, promised to clear death row in 4 years and make sure that 51 people were executed. So this gentleman, Jimmy Duncan, got in touch with me. We'd met previously in 2016 and stayed in touch over the years. And then he got back in touch with me through mutual friends and said, I need you to, I'm ready to talk and tell my story
Okay,
after
so
years of being worried about telling it.
so he is the one who reached out to you and who wanted to talk about his story.
We'd been in touch before. I made another film in 2017 called Met While Incarcerated about successful women who meet and marry men in prison for violent crimes. And so I had actually come in contact with his next door neighbor on death row. And he was one of the characters in my documentary. And he said to me one day, you've got to meet my buddy Jimmy. He's innocent. And I know people believe that's something that people in prison say all the time, but they don't. And so I thought, okay, I need to look into this. And I did a bit of Googling and I thought, oh God, this is the worst. Like the crime he was convicted of is literally the definition of the worst of the worst. It is something that even the most liberal person thinks if that happened, that person should die. They should
Yeah.
possibly be executed. It's the case for the definition of the worst of the worst. So I thought, oh, great, and I started looking into it. And talking to him and I said, I do see there's really some outrageous things that have already been exposed. I can dig into this if you want me to. And he said, no, I have new lawyers on my case, a pro bono team, and the Innocence Project had just joined his case soon before then. And so he said, I'm going to get out any day now. And, we'll talk after. And then we reconnected several times, and it wasn't until 8 years later when he said to me, okay, I'm finally getting my chance at freedom. I only have one and I need your help. And I said, yes, absolutely. And I gave up everything I was doing. And all I did was pour myself into this for, the next 2.5 years.
Wow, and that's really that's very nice of you to do, especially that, like he's in the US, you're Canadian, and it's interesting that you're actually helping him and interested in his story. Makes you wonder what the Americans are doing. Like, why aren't they giving attention? But that's very nice of you, Catherine. But Maria, you're also involved in this documentary. So how did you get involved?
It was the strangest thing,
Yeah.
actually, but a blessing at the same time. Um, I received a message from Catherine indicating that she was referred over to me by one of my appellate counsels, Alison Craig, who again, I put her in high regard. And just to assist in here, they needed somebody to stand in one of the roles. And so I said, sure, if it's involving a wrongful conviction case or somebody that's making proclamation of innocence, and if there's any way that I could lend some hand to help, I will. And then eventually, Catherine and I got to speaking and I realized immediately right off the cuff how much um, Jimmy Duncan and I actually had in common in terms of the
Mhm.
journey. While our sentences and the prison terms are different, there's a lot that actually interconnected. And so when I met Catherine and I went on site for the filming, um, I would go in as one of the jurors in the films. And I won't do any spoilers here, but I can say that in the process of filming that day, I learned a lot. It was my first time actually hearing Jimmy's voice, and that was a very emotional moment. And when I say I learned a lot about the people that may potentially sit as a jury one day.
Yeah.
And so, here we are. We've become very close friends, Catherine, myself, and then Jimmy and I actually message each other from time to time to check in. And it was really what I consider to be a relationship that was meant to happen by fate. And so if there's anything that I can do to assist not only Jimmy, but other people on that journey, I will do that.
Yes, and obviously, I mean, as you mentioned, Maria, there is this history in common that you have with Jimmy, so you totally understand what he has been and is going through right now. But just to clarify, so will Jimmy appear in the documentary in any way, shape, or form? I know we don't want to give too much about the movie; it's not out yet, the documentary, but just to give a little bit of heads up, does he appear?
So Jimmy and I began a series of phone calls. We had hundreds into the thousands, probably easily, of phone calls about his case. You think you're going to do, an interview, maybe 4 or 5 phone calls, do an interview, and then that would be it. And then maybe
Yeah.
months later, keep up. But it just wasn't that kind of a thing. We had so much to figure out about what happened. So we just started talking, and I got on his phone list and we started talking, and we were able to talk as much as we could afford to. And so we had conversations, and we would talk about what was going on in his case, and we'd talk about what I was finding, and he'd help me navigate it because it is a different system
Yeah.
than the Canadian system. So I had to understand procedurally how a capital conviction works and what their appeal process is, and how it works, and also understand Louisiana, which I had a taste of and I'm fascinated by. I really am fascinated by the state and its politics and its justice slash injustice system. So I really needed it to navigate that, because I'm this Canadian who oftentimes, I think it was so beneficial to come in as someone who had a belief still in the system, that believed that, good could prevail, and truth could prevail. But I also had enough of an understanding of court cases, and really, murder cases in particular. I had enough of an understanding to know that in the adversarial system, there's two sides that are very narrow narratives that are presented in court, and they are responding really to each other, but not to the truth. And so I knew there was a lot of truth that existed around this. So that's what we had so many conversations about: his life growing up. We both grew up in the 90s. We were almost around the same age. We had a lot in common. He reminded me of all the guys I went to high school with. And he was somebody who, just like me or many other people in their 20s, their life could go in one direction or it could go in another, and his went in the other. So we just really connected on that, and we had these phone calls. And eventually, what I decided to do as a filmmaker, an editorial and creative choice, was to represent him in various points in the film, with a visual representation that we did through AI. And you do actually see him in the film. It's based on his, likeness. He was able to send me small videograms, and we were able to use those and photos of his, and AI did a pretty miraculous job creating a real Jimmy. And so we brought him in and we synced it up to his real voice. So he is able to be just like every other person in the film, make a connection with the viewer that I felt was really necessary for him to be properly heard.
And so is the documentary then representing his case? Is it about his case, a reenactment of the case?
It's
Or,
about his case and others. So
okay.
it's about, I wanted it to not seem isolated, because it really is fairly outrageous. Like I call his conviction an outrageous conviction. The story that was presented of the crime is, I call it a horror story. And many people feel that way about it. He was convicted in 1998, for the rape and murder of a 23-month-old child named Haley Olivo, who was his girlfriend's daughter and was in his care. He was babysitting her, and he was convicted of her rape and murder. And just really the presentation of it was a horrific narrative that was almost beyond belief, and in fact was beyond belief.
Yeah.
And so part of what we did was, and this is where Maria comes in. I don't really believe as a filmmaker in reenactments, especially of true crime or crimes. There's contentious elements to it. I don't believe in creating reality with a visual element that you're making something true that may not be true, that may only be partially true.
Mhm.
So I try to stay away from it. But I really wanted people to feel the weight and the drama of exactly what he was accused of and convicted of and what the jurors heard. And so rather than do a series of reenactments, I used a technique where I created a mock jury, and the mock jury were real people who were brought together, and they were given a script, given a narrative of some elements that were presented in court, some journalistic articles, a series of elements, but mostly court testimony. And they didn't know anything about it. They were brought together for the first time. They were brought into a film studio, and we moved the jury through these rooms in a film studio, and they read the transcripts to each other and then reacted to them and then talked about what they were hearing and talked about the evidence, what the prosecutor presented, what the defense presented. And I knew I wanted to have a people's real responses to what they were hearing. I had no idea how powerful it would be. I
Mhm.
had no idea how overwhelmed the people would be and involved and sophisticated and smart, and they were figuring things out as they went. And Maria was part of that. She was part of the jury who came in and kind of navigated through these elements of the case through the course of a day. And it's really the sort of spine of the film that you're experiencing what was put forward in court, and afterwards through the eyes of these jurors.
And that's a very important point here because these cases obviously revolve about the evidence that's put in front of the jurors, because that's
Mhm,
based on which they will make a determination ultimately. And in
mhm,
wrongful convictions, unfortunately, in those cases, it's sometimes the information, especially the scientific evidence that's put forward, that can be problematic,
mhm,
shaped by a specific narrative, and that influences the whole case and the outcome of the case. I know Maria's case has been like that. We're not going to
mhm.
get into Maria's case, but this is in general the problem in these types of cases. It's actually the information that is put before them. And so maybe we can talk about that, Catherine and Maria,
Mhm.
and also about why you made this movie. Why did you decide to make this movie and talk about this story? What's the wider message behind it?
Mhm. Well, I would love Maria to jump in on, I'll just tee her up here, but for me, one of the most important things is, and you mentioned, is it Jimmy Duncan's case? And I said it's his and others.
Yes.
Because what I was trying to show was that this was a pattern.
Hmm.
It was systemic. It was built into the system.
Unfortunately, yes.
That's right. It was built into the system on purpose because there were a couple of a forensic pathologist and a forensic dentist or odontologist who were involved in this case. But they were and involved in many others, Dr. Michael West and Dr. Stephen Hain, who have become notorious. There's been books written about them and articles written about them, and most recently, John Grisham wrote about them in his book Framed about wrongful convictions. And they really, were able to, because they got convictions and they got wins for the prosecution with miraculous results, completely unscientific. Um, on call for hire. They were able to do this in Mississippi and Louisiana over the course of almost 2 decades. Thousands and thousands of cases, unscientific opinions delivered with complete certainty and extremely persuasive to juries and extremely hard to undo. So, I wanted to tee up, one of the most important moments I think is Maria, talking about the weight of science in the court, forensic science in the courtroom, or just what these experts bring. And especially we can talk about after if we want around the mystery often that surrounds child death and our lack of understanding really and the evolving science around that.
Yes, because that's also a common point between Maria's story and the Jimmy Duncan story. So,
That's right.
Maria, if you can tell us your view on this.
I think that's important. The film is very important in that it speaks to how important, and I can't stress enough how important the narrative of a forensic expert can influence how a prosecution is handled and
Mhm.
how potential jurors or even just a general community will read into it and not know
Mm.
A, either how to understand the medical terminology
Yeah,
or what comes behind it. What they see is this person murdered this person. This is a child that has died.
allegedly, right?
That's
Mhm.
right. This is what
Allegedly,
I'm saying,
a
right?
very important
Well,
word.
I mean, the media, and I'm not including you on this, Catherine. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm saying this as respectfully as possible because I've met many incredible journalists since the Gouge Inquiry that are actually doing the hardcore work. But the scary part of it is that whether it's one forensic expert or two or however many, the narrative that's delivered over to prosecution and police department is going to start steamrolling how that person is going to be looked at, how they're going to be judged, how the evidence is going to be treated. But meanwhile, all of this is going on, not realizing that, this forensic expert is either um, providing pseudoscientific findings or
Mhm.
fabricated ones.
Mhm.
That's harmful,
Yeah.
extremely harmful, especially to somebody like Jimmy Duncan, who's sitting on death row for over 2 decades, maintaining his innocence on a crime that he never committed. Okay, they're even a crime, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Now, the cases of children, and this is the commonality between myself and Jimmy's case, is that, we were their caregivers. We were the very close to them. We were the next
There's
person
a
to, you know,
relationship here, yes, of
right. So
trust.
when you hear that, your instinct, generally, most people that I've canvassed when I've spoken with some people, is that their instinct is you're absolutely, like you said, Catherine, the worst of the worst.
Mhm.
I've been called the scum of the earth. The comments about, capital punishment, putting someone to death. I mean,
Mhm.
as human beings, we're also very visual. And so that
Mhm.
comes at 2 points, right? The first point is visual when the news first, when the case first hits the news, people have that narrative that's been put out by the police. And then it's very powerful when it comes back many years later when the people or innocence advocates or anybody, a staunch criminal defense lawyer goes, I'm going to roll up my sleeves, I'm going to burn the candle at both ends, and I'm going to find the truth in all of this. And then when it comes all out, what happens? The family's affected, the person that's been wrongly convicted has been affected, and these are lifelong effects. They're
Hmm.
not
Mhm.
just, something that you can just brush off.
Yeah.
And those are the commonalities in terms of where Jimmy and I um, connected as well. But there's also the connection in terms of Haley Olivo's mom,
Mhm.
right? And the emotional roller coaster and trauma that she has gone through. And this film is powerful when you watch it. And you will see it, and I guarantee you will feel her pain. And it's just one of those things where it's so, so important that we try and encourage people to learn more about a case before they pass judgment because sometimes a wrongly convicted person who doesn't have access to that kind of media, they're not the first person the media is going to go to.
Yeah.
My instinct back in the day was that it was important for them to get this case out in the open because ultimately it would influence the general public.
Mhm.
And so for me, I'm just somebody that was very small in the community. I didn't matter. And so I was, to me, very powerless at the time. And at for Jimmy's case, I feel that he was powerless too. He's a male. Haley was very, very young, a young girl, a baby actually. And, this also rings true to the connection of Williams Mullins Johnson's case. And so
Absolutely.
yeah, it's not restrictive to one case. What happens
Or
is
to
it,
one
it's
country, sorry,
systemic.
No,
to one country, because your
Absolutely.
Canadian case, Jimmy's case is in the US. So that's scary because it's a pattern that is happening um, in different countries at the same time.
and I
Absolutely.
want to
And
say something about that. Sorry to interrupt, but
okay.
this idea that like I had to pitch this around to get people to listen to this story.
Yeah,
When you're making a film, you have to raise money. You have to pitch it to people and they
yeah,
give you money to make it. And it's a lot more difficult. I should just write books or write articles or something. It's a lot more difficult to do this. But when you have a terrible crime, a horrible crime, people are not interested in giving you money for it.
yeah,
And so there's all of these obstacles to actually getting the kind of platform that I did manage to get on this one. And I fought tooth and nail every step of the way to get it. And people who are involved in this kind of work will understand it. But when I first went to Jimmy and he wasn't ready to tell his story, I thought, okay, well, I'll come back to you. And I actually went at that time and became executive producer of The Fifth Estate at CBC. And I thought, I want to know, what's going on here. And I looked into some things, and I looked into um, some cases in Canada, and we ended up finding a case that was really, a series of cases that was really important, and we did a big story about them, and we uncovered some things that never would have been uncovered before. And so, more recently, I was talking to someone in the Canadian innocence community, and they said, "Well, why should we care about a case from death row? Like we have so many of our own,
yeah.
And I said, well,
And that's an important
because."
question.
It is.
Yeah.
And I said to her, I said, well, it's important because they're all connected. I
Mm.
mean, if the fact is that I heard about Jimmy Duncan's case, and when I said, researched it, a pivotal moment in his case was right around the time William Mullins Johnson's case was exposed as a wrongful conviction. They have so many similarities. It's
Hmm.
probably the most similar case you could imagine to Jimmy Duncan's. It
Yeah.
was all the same science misread, all of the same mistakes made. How is it that there's this huge high profile case coming forward around 2007, 2008 in Canada, a game changer? Louisiana, never heard of it, right? This is a pivotal moment in Jimmy's case. No one knew about William Mullins Johnson.
Yeah.
I told his lawyers about the case. I had to tell his lawyers about a case that was similar to his that was in Mississippi. They didn't know about that one either. These were other cases with very similar circumstances. And when I was talking to this woman, in Canada, and she asked me, what does it have to do with each other? I started to tell the story of when I went to the Fifth Estate and said, there's a story here to do. And we did this, I started to tell her about this case of this woman in British Columbia and how
Mhm.
she was convicted of a child murder. And then she said to me, "You're not talking about Tammy Bouvette, are you?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "Oh, Tammy Bouvette's case is going to the Supreme Court of Canada this week, and we're going to be discussing it." And I said, "That's my story." And that came because of Jimmy Duncan.
Mhm.
It came because I, as a journalist, learned his story and then said, I wonder if there's other stories like this. And I dug into it. And it was one of those cases that, had we not put a team of journalists on it and worked on it, it never would have been discovered what happened in Tammy's case. And she was a person who was utterly, destroyed by what happened to her. You don't have to be in prison for and on death row and almost lose your life to have this impact you, just like it did with Maria, just like it did with Tammy. People's lives are ruined by it. And one of the things I really focused on, because people have tired of the wrongful conviction story.
Yeah.
They are tired of it. They tell me, they don't tell everyone else, but they tell me, oh, another one. Oh, yeah, these happen all the time. You can go on to a podcast and see 400 episodes of wrongful convictions, and it turns my stomach. And so, how do you break through?
Yeah.
And this is what I mean, is that we have to actually see that it's about the pain. it's about the loss, it's about the grief. It's not just that one person. You know, these do affect up to 100 people within
Yeah.
the sphere of that person, and all of those families, you know, are affected by these stories. And so I wanted to tell a story of the pain, and I wanted to unite Maria's pain with Jimmy's pain, with Jeff Havard's pain, or other cases that I look at in here and say, you know, it's all the same pain.
It is across countries, across jurisdictions, but also it's the same problems, same systemic problem that seems to
Hmm.
be a recurrent theme. It's this glorification kind almost of experts in
Hmm.
these types of cases, which is a problem. And maybe this is something that I would like to talk a little bit to both of you
Hmm.
about. Why do we have this problem? Why is it that it seems like when an expert is on the stand and starts talking, and I don't know, maybe it is because the language is so big and nobody really understands. So people assume that, oh, this guy or this woman knows what they're talking about, so they must be right. But this is a recurrent theme in many of these cases is that there's an expert who gives an opinion. It seems to go in and the jury believes it and finds it credible, and there's a conviction based on it. And many years later, turns out that there was a mistake on the part of the expert, or it wasn't true, it wasn't accurate. So, why do we have this perception? It seems like it's in the US and in Canada as well. So, maybe we can talk a little bit about that because it is concerning.
Yeah. Do you want to start, Maria?
Sure, I can touch on that. I just want to, on a side note, in terms of, somebody in Canada maybe helping somebody out on a case in the United States. I cannot stress enough the importance of remembering that wrongful convictions are a global problem. Having been a person that um, walked through those roads and journeys, uh, Canada isn't a standalone in terms of wrongful convictions, and neither is the USA or the
Mhm.
UK. Like I said, it's global. A wrongful conviction is a wrongful conviction. Wherever we can get help, we will. I mean, you're not going to say to somebody that perhaps comes to you and says, I'm in desperate need of help. Well, no, I'm not going to help you because you're not American. No, a wrongful conviction, and true advocates will say, I will lend whatever help I can. Now, there are some restrictions in terms of organizations that can't do international
Mhm.
cases for whatever reason. Lots of it has to do with funding, but it certainly doesn't mean we don't care or the organization doesn't care. But me as a wrongly convicted person stepping in and getting myself involved in cases that are outside of Canada is not
Hmm.
because I'm trying to make a name for myself. It's because a person's life is at risk for the very reason that I actually suffered and my family suffered.
Hmm.
Now, in terms of why is this happening and what are we looking at? Let's look at that. What we've learned over the years, anyways, that I've learned since having been wrongly convicted and my acquittal being entered, there was lack of oversight in the 1990s. And
Hmm.
in the case where Smith is concerned, like the earliest cases were in early 1990s, I believe it was the late 89, 90s. I'm one of those earliest cases, but there was already red flags at the time.
Hmm.
So who was watching? Well, somebody was watching, somebody knew about it and it got swept under the rug. We know that through the gouge inquiry. Okay, that's clear. There was an over-reliance on experts and their evidence. Okay, to the point that experts were treated almost like God. All right. Then we also have the problem where experts weren't properly vetted to determine whether or not they had the training necessary to do what they were asked to do. Then we also hear, well, they needed to fill positions at the OCCO, and as a result of that, Smith took this position. These are just things that are concerning in the sense that it does not excuse a wrongful conviction. At any point in time, somebody can make the right decision, the humanly right decision. I shouldn't do this. I can't do this. No. We saw case after case after case that got pushed through the criminal justice system. And unfortunately, Pandora's box gets open some 20 years later, 16 years later, only to realize that it wasn't just one and it wasn't just two. It wasn't 10, it was more. That's the problem. And I know that there's a lot of work being done right now in terms of making sure that there's education to members of the bar and the judiciary to recognize and um, look for these red flags, but also maintain the gatekeeping role. We didn't have that back then. So yes, it's a continuing problem
Yeah. I
and it's
think you're
global.
right, Maria. Yeah, like on that note, a lot of forensic science from the early 90s, it was a real Wild West sort of, this combination of time, I call it like pre-internet, pre-DNA and really pre-innocence movement, when a conviction was a conviction, all kinds of science that really, isn't reliable, experts who weren't accredited. There was no real standard. Once something was admitted, like in Jimmy Duncan's case, bite mark um, match comparison is absolute garbage. It is still taught in universities in Canada, by the way. I looked it up in the forensics programs, and if I can do one thing, it will be to get rid of that. Because frankly, like some of this stuff has to stop. We have to have professionals and experts stand up and say, it's over now. We're not doing this anymore. We agree that this is gone. And I was looking at bite mark cases in Canada and the history of them. And interestingly enough, one of the big foundational papers that came forward from the NAME organization looked at a variety of forensic sciences. I can't remember if it was 2007 or 8, but had this moment where and I believe it was a presidential initiative in the US to request this examination of forensic sciences. And this foundational report was produced in the US, and it's actually what's used in Canada to say, we're not going to use bite mark evidence anymore. So it is international. Science is science in almost every other field, but for some reason in forensics, every country gets to have their own. That's wrong. We need to start stepping up. We need professional organizations, pathologists, forensic science, pediatricians, doctors, medical associations, and we need to start coming together and saying, we've got facts and we've got the past, and we need to start, be able to rectify the past, which is, something Canada's a bit better at than the US is. Um, but we also need to understand that our understanding of science evolves. Now, that period of the early 90s is riddled with errors and terrible experts, unqualified, unscientific judgments and decisions. And when I did a quick look at how many people were on death row right now in the US, in the various states, most of the states I looked at, upwards of 60, even to 70% of the people on death row are from that time period. There's some dodgy science connected with this, but it starts with, kind of what Maria said in the first place when it comes to child deaths, is that there's very often, too often from that time period, and even today we're seeing it, an assumption of a crime. We
Exactly.
haven't
And I
even
wanted to
established that a
ask,
crime has
yeah,
happened.
that's the
And,
thing, the presumption
that's
of
why
innocence. Yes.
well, it's not even presumption of
Yeah.
innocence. It's prove there was a crime.
Yeah.
Was this a homicide versus an accident? Was it,
Mhm.
Jimmy Duncan was originally charged with negligent homicide because he left a child in a bathtub. The child, Haley Olivo, was in a bathtub in 3 inches of water, just enough water to cover her toys. She is a very physically capable child. She was in the bathtub playing with those toys. He was talking to her most of the time. He went to the other side of the wall, of that same wall, and was talking to her through the wall when she, suffered a seizure, that she had a medical history and she had a head injury recently before that. And so it was a terrible series of illness, injury, and accident that led to her death, but there was no sign of a crime. There was no blood on the scene. There was no DNA. There was zero sign of a crime. And yet this is where you have this important and crucial decision coming in saying this was a homicide. And then everything proceeds. Well, I would argue from Maria's case to Jimmy Duncan's case to Jeff Havard's, William Mullins Johnson, others, when you look at Lucy Letby, in the UK right now, we're talking about a misunderstanding of child deaths, where we're having people, Tammy Bouvette, where people have assumed, mostly pathologists, that not only has there been a murder, but there has been a history of abuse that they are creating. They are
Mhm.
creating it with their observations. In Jimmy Duncan's case, they actually fabricated it. And that's a part of his story. But when it's such a mystery, I looked at the Lucy Letby case and I say, how is this still going on? And someone in the UK, sort of suggested that perhaps we need to address this more fundamentally and say that when it comes to a child death, maybe rather than expert versus expert, we need to, and really, as I say, working on old science that is still acceptable. And it's ridiculous, that it's still acceptable, and it's still being used, and the jury doesn't know that. And so when in the Lucy Letby case, someone put forward the idea that perhaps there should be a panel of experts who determine based on the science if they believe there has been a crime before it even proceeds, similar to what you'd have with a voir dire on a confession.
Mhm.
When you have evidence this powerful, it should be tested. There
Yeah.
should be a bar to meet. But once someone's a baby killer, and once that headline comes up, and once that insinuation was made, it was very evident in our story and in the jury selection on Jimmy Duncan's case. There were many people who said, I cannot come back from this. I will not ever be able to be objective. And then add a dash of science from someone
Yeah.
who claims to be credible and has testified in hundreds, if not thousands, of other cases. That's it. You know, seal the deal.
And so there are two things here. So on the experts, though, they don't necessarily have to be unqualified. Sometimes even a
No,
qualified expert and a legitimate expert, but he can be
that's right.
wrong. That's a problem that we have, is that we have a hard time believing
Yes.
that an expert can be wrong. They can be wrong.
And the science can be out of date. It could be
Exactly. And the
something we
science
believed
can,
in
yeah,
1990 and
yeah.
we know isn't right anymore.
Right. So that's one issue that we're dealing, I think, with as a society, is that we tend to give so much trust to the expert who's in court and giving evidence that whatever comes out of their mouth must be the truth and it must be
Mhm.
the right decision. So we have to believe the expert and just go with that. But then the other
Well,
problem, yeah, go ahead, Maria.
oh, sorry, if I can just add,
Mhm.
cases involving child deaths, it's an instant public cry for
Mhm.
an immediate, like an immediate look close to the case in terms of find the perpetrator and find them now. I mean, there's
That's
no
right.
question that that
It's very
happens.
No.
emotional. Like
Absolutely.
it
Yes.
really touches on people's emotions, and people really react more than reason when
Hmm.
they're hearing about these cases, because they're extreme. I mean, there's horrible cases, and then there's these types of cases that are a level higher of horrific. But then this brings me to the other point that I wanted to raise with both of you. It's this also, when we have these horrible facts that are
Hmm.
so, like, people cannot make sense out of them, because it's very difficult to accept that a
Hmm.
child died, and we want to put the blame on someone. But then
Hmm.
it's this public reaction, and in general, not just the public, politicians and the media, that it's right away this assumption of guilt, that the person is guilty and they're responsible for everything. And we saw that in it didn't, thank God it didn't end up being a wrongful conviction in the Zamir case, where right away also
Hmm.
there was this jump into a conclusion that this guy, oh, he killed that cop for sure. But then the trial, luckily in his case, the trial ended up showing the truth. He didn't have to be wrongfully convicted. So he was lucky. Mr. Zamir was lucky in that case. But that's not the case in other cases. Like Maria is a victim of that, and
Hmm.
Jimmy is also, a victim. And so that's the problem here. Why do we have this problem of people jumping into these conclusions and right away the presumption of guilt, as opposed to the constitutional presumption of innocence?
If I
Well,
can
this
just,
was, I
That's right.
actually think this is worse than ever because I go on social media and social media there no one understands the law anymore. And this is
Yeah.
one of the reasons I did this. And this is the reason I want to have these justice screenings and I want to connect with the legal community and I
Yeah.
want to connect with the forensics community and law schools and police colleges is because people don't you go online and someone even gets arrested or they're investigating them or the police showed up at their house and they're already guilty to the public.
Yeah.
So we've completely lost that sense of it, but it's especially lost in these cases because you have a person, just like as Maria said, you have a caregiver. Most of these crimes or cases where a crime has been read a non-murder murder, a non-crime crime
Yeah.
is in the case of where a person is alone with a child or the last person with the child or the person caregiving them when something terrible happens. And so, all kinds of conclusions are jumped to what I wonder about is how we can start to really mitigate that because we have to assume, and I know there's going to be all kinds of defense lawyers on here who have all kinds of, want to say, oh, innocent until proven guilty and everybody deserves a proper defense, but the public doesn't believe that.
Hmm.
Okay.
That's
They
true.
don't, and they believe it less and less. And when you talk about someone who's accused of a rape and murder of a child, people want that person dead. And these are literally the crimes that people say, I saw numbers that said that we were one election away from capital punishment coming back in Canada, potentially being revisited because we have people who believe that there are these terrible criminals out there who are committing these awful crimes and that that true justice would be vengeance. And so let's just deal with that. We're at that level and be honest about it and say, the public doesn't understand these things because we're not doing our jobs. We're not saying to people, this is how it works and this is what it means. And I really believe that in the case of this jury, in my documentary, I interview a juror who was on Jimmy Duncan's trial. And she, voted to convict him and to execute him. And I walked her through, the evidence that was found and the discovery of it. And there was so much to undo around that and so much, but she was very clear that she was very unclear, even at the original trial. She
Hmm.
didn't think they proved a sexual assault. She didn't think that they proved that the bite marks she
That's
thought were
scary, though.
nonsense.
Yeah.
Oh no, she said, I had all kinds of questions about that and
Well,
questions
how
about
did
this,
she
but
not have a reasonable doubt then?
well, because they had a very persuasive district attorney whose opening statements, which is a big part of the film, his opening statements were I'd say 80% narrative. He didn't prove most of the outrageous claims that he made. He did present a horror story that affected everyone in the family, in the town, in the community, the police officers. And when you put that narrative out there and you don't actually have real evidence to back it up, um, it's you can't undo it. It created a hysteria. It created a moral panic in this community that every person, first responders, people who worked in the hospital, people who knew them before, suddenly everyone was adapting their narrative to make this man a monster. And it was them helping. Everyone thinks they're helping. And
Yeah.
if we think this kind of crime actually happened to a child, if I thought it actually happened to a child and happened to my child, I can't say, if I'm being completely honest, that I wouldn't want police to do whatever they had to do and prosecutors to do whatever they had to get that person convicted. Now, I don't believe in the death penalty, but this is where we get into this idea, and people have had profound changes of mind on the death penalty because of this film, which is intentional. I want people to question, our long sentences, our verdicts, what our positions for being able to appeal things, how we validate our science. All of these things we can do, but what we can't undo is the horror story. And we have to really realize the responsibility, I think, both prosecutors and really defense attorneys and journalists about we have to become a little bit more dispassionate about this and
Mhm.
really dig into the facts and the truth, less than kind of this court narrative versus that court narrative. It's not serving anyone. It's not serving us.
And unfortunately, with these types of stories, especially the very traumatic and horrible ones, once you associate a case with a person, even if many years after the person is found to be wrongfully convicted, it's very
Mhm.
difficult to dissociate the person from that story. So it's almost like a stigma that's going to follow the person for the rest of their lives, and that they're going to have to work so hard to change their image about
That's right.
this problem. And
Well,
it's,
I
yeah,
mean, you can ask Maria about that,
yeah,
but I can tell you in the Jimmy Duncan case that originally, of course, like any lawyers, they don't want who have an opportunity for an evidentiary hearing, they don't really want a journalist getting involved. It's not the ideal time for them to have someone come in and talk about the story. And you have to really believe that someone's going to be responsible and do it responsibly, because
mhm,
there are cases where journalists have undone good work that lawyers have done. But what I can say is that when I spoke to his lawyers very early on, because they weren't helpful to me, and they couldn't be, we agreed that my job was different from theirs, and I said, your job might be to get him free, and my job is for him to be free. You know, be free of this narrative, of this monster narrative, of this horror story narrative, to have people actually understand him and how things went wrong, so that whether he gets a chance to come out or not, he actually gets to, have his name cleared, which at many points, Jimmy Duncan had accepted potentially being executed. But there were moments where he said to me, if that family can just know the truth, if the public can just know the truth, if we can make sure this doesn't happen again, like, I've accepted what might come.
yeah. And that's scary because we want to think of trials as the forum where the truth comes out. But these
Mhm.
cases show that no, it's not necessarily the
Yeah.
truth that comes out at a trial. It is a truth that a party wants to show, and that
Mhm.
ends up winning the case. So it's really scary to know. But Maria, I want to hear your thoughts also on this point.
Well, geez, what can I say? There's similarities. Imagine Jimmy was like Haley's stepdad,
Mhm.
and Cassandra, I'm just stepmom,
Mhm.
right? Labels don't help. They don't help at all. And it's, I think I've done a lot better with trying not to get emotional, but I think one of the things that made me extremely emotional in terms of Jimmy's case, and I wrote this in my letter to I guess the court, was it Catherine? It was the court, or
Yes.
it was sent out to them in support of Jimmy. You cannot bring an innocent person back from the grave. You
Yeah.
can't bring them back to life. And for those of us that suffered here in Canada that didn't go through capital punishment or the death penalty, many of us have died in many parts of our soul because of it, punished for loving the children that we love still. Um, but I need to touch Catherine into this proposal as well of having a body of experts come to an agreement that this is the appropriate, step in moving forward. I'm going to flash back and ask everybody to remember what the SCAN team unit was at Sick Kids back in the 90s. Suspected child abuse, I guess, at SCAN network. They were a group that would come together and make a determination, essentially. How is
I
it?
agree. Well, I think they have to be cross-examined. Like, it has
Yeah,
to be done by the court, not an independent
yeah,
entity where people are paid. It's not appropriate. It would have to be conducted with a level of, scrutiny from
yeah,
from both the
absolutely.
defense and the Crown, right? But I think you should have to achieve, it's just like a confession. The best we can do is do our best to make sure that it's a real confession.
Mhm.
But at least we're trying.
Yeah.
We're trying to have that extra step. If we see this pattern in child deaths, what can we do?
I think this is
to
just a
be
general
better.
problem. Child death is even more concerning, but in any wrongful
Hmm.
conviction case involving the passing of an individual, I mean, there's far more layers to it than people know. The general public, like I
Right.
said, will not know how to understand the prosecution, how it's moving forward. All they know is that this person is being prosecuted. They believe that there's enough evidence to convict. And as a result of that, the narrative is going to fly, right?
Hmm.
But if we take the time to educate more and perhaps help people understand that it could happen to you or somebody that you love or somebody that might be a colleague to you, and then all of a sudden you're in shock, and then they're in prison and they're proclaiming their innocence all this time, and then 2 decades later they've spent 2 decades trying to say, I've been telling the truth the whole time.
Hmm.
And as I said, when I met at the roundtable for the Miscarriages of Justice Review Commission, creating a wrongful conviction is so much faster than getting them back
Hmm.
and giving them back their lives. Why is that?
Hmm.
Because no amount of days or years or I'm sorry's will ever truly heal somebody. And I imagine, like when I see Jimmy's post sometimes, other people might not get the post that he does. I do. And
Hmm.
it's strange. It's the most um there's no words, there's nothing to say. But if you've walked the same path,
Hmm.
similarly in areas, you'll just understand what that post is about. And sometimes people don't openly want to talk about the wrongful conviction and the tragedy. But this is where it's really important to understand that prosecution doesn't always get it right. The police aren't always right. We've got good prosecutors and crown attorneys and district attorneys and good police officers. But what about the ones that are actually tainting the good ones?
Well, and,
Who's
and
doing
speaking of the
something about
police, especially in Toronto, we're seeing that there's a huge problem right now with the police, the way they're conducting themselves, whether it's while they're doing their jobs or off duty. So, I mean, maybe the timing of the documentary is also really important because we're at a time now where we're starting to question the work of many of the people who are involved in the criminal justice system. And
it?
it's not that we don't want to respect these people, but we just should be holding them at the same level of standard. I find like people are too excessively harsh on the defense lawyers, but they give a lot of pass to the prosecutors, the police officers. Um, and they need to know that these people need to also be scrutinized. They should also, you can't just blindly trust a police officer because he's a police officer or a prosecutor because he's a prosecutor and then trash the defense lawyer because they're who they're defending.
Well,
So,
Well,
immunity for forensic experts involved in cases where a wrongful conviction
yeah,
is eventually the end result.
yeah.
The immunity blanket needs to come off.
Hmm.
I can see why it's tricky because I actually, after reviewing so many of these different cases, I don't know why anyone would be a medical examiner. It sounds to me like the worst job in the world. And no one ever leaves their job, even, no matter how high they climb. It seems like almost everyone leaves in some kind of disgrace. So it's a really like we have a serious issue to look at here. But what I wonder about, because of course we have the old bad apples argument and the
Yeah.
old, well, why aren't we identifying them? And I'm finding again this weariness around wrongful convictions that people feel so powerless after the fact and think like I've got things I got to worry about today, let alone something that happened to someone 30 years ago. I'm sorry for them, but what can I do? I actually think we need to our legal system has become so separate from us and our community and from, we need to re-engage. We
Hmm.
need, to really think about educating the public that the justice system is theirs. We need a lot more connection on this. I hear a lot of this, tough on crime talk, and it's very easy to platform and talk about our laws in a way of that, somebody's worried about having their car stolen or their garage broken into. But are we really talking about that our system is a system and certain fundamentals work together, and that we have to, not just pin it on this bad person or that bad person on either side, but say, how do we understand this? How do we make sure we're improving it? In the US, every talk that I've given, I've said to people there, your most powerful vote you can make on justice is your district attorney, because they vote for a person who has an incredible amount of power in their community.
Mhm.
And interestingly enough, in Jimmy Duncan's case, the person who was the judge on his evidentiary hearing has Judge Alvin Sharp has since after 30 years on the bench stepped down and is now running for district attorney against the very district attorney who is prosecuting and frankly persecuting Jimmy Duncan. And so it's become, we have to understand that we do have an impact on our justice system. We can be involved in it. Media doesn't report on the courts anymore. So people have lost any connection to it outside of seeing a, mugshot and saying, get them. That's we have to take some responsibility here and think about this bridge between these two worlds. People just don't understand it anymore, or what influence they can have on it. And I come back to what we were talking about, Maria, the professional community. How is it the justice system operates, and forensic science operates outside of pediatricians and outside of emergency workers and outside of, EMTs, and like, why is there this little secret world off somewhere that other professional associations aren't constantly jumping in on and saying, we have new science, we have new stuff. Do you know about this? Engaging, it's just become siloed. That to me seems like one area we could actually just start to look at and say, why aren't we doing better here?
As I was going to say, just in response to that, it's an onion, right?
Mm.
There's so many layers in regards to, getting it right. The system moves slowly, but albeit slowly, we need to try and actively move forward quicker. We need to have um, better knowledge and education on how to move it forward. But in terms of the layers, one layer could take years and decades before it even happens. But as long as there are dedicated, loyal individuals that are, focused on achieving this, we're still going to go forward.
And
And
there,
that's the
yeah.
importance.
And there
Mhm.
has to be also an appreciation of the process. There's a way to prove that something happened, and less focus on the policies, what our goals are. You can have a
Yeah.
goal, you want to punish people, you want to find, and that's fine. We all want the true, real criminal to be punished, but there's a way to get there. And if there are problems in the prosecution, then we shouldn't just absolutely find someone guilty and condemn them just because, well, we just need an answer to this, and this is the guy who's available. I don't care if this expert or how it's done is right or wrong. I feel like sometimes this is what we're seeing, is that people just want to jump to the conclusion, want to skip the process, or don't really care how things are done. But no, there is a system. The reason why we have a legal system is there's a way to get to an end result, and it should be respected. And I think that's why maybe what you both of you said, there has to be an education to the public on the importance, not just of, like uh, maybe the roles of people, but how we get to an end result. And maybe that's what people are not really, there isn't much education
I
on.
think I
People,
think this film is going to
yeah.
be super important for
Yes.
anybody that gets a letter in the mail that says you have been vetted to be a juror,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Well,
Uh,
speaking though of the
Understand it.
movie, because we don't have a release date yet, but it's coming up sometime either this year, sorry, or early next year, right?
It's we're looking at now having so the film is completed and I'm doing these justice screenings. They're private screenings sponsored by justice communities who really want to talk about it now.
Mhm.
And Jimmy Duncan's case is still unfolding. So we've been doing that in Louisiana and Mississippi. I was just in the home of Hain and West, where they wreaked havoc on the justice system for almost 20 years, and they're still trying to call for some kind of an inquiry into Dr. Haynes' work specifically. And they had never really heard of the Gouge inquiry. So I was happy to talk to people there about what we've done in Canada and some similar circumstances, because there's not really a pathway to that. I hope that we can talk about those things in that way, and the film inspires every screening we've had. We have an activated audience. People are mad. I can see it on their face. They're
Yeah.
terrified, they're mad, they're shocked, they want to do something. They are completely activated, and I just hope we can keep that going. We're looking to a festival premiere, and where that might be. Would love it to be TIFF. If anyone has any pull or
Yeah.
connections, we would love to have that here, at our home. And but we also will have, we have our broadcaster is Hollywood Suite in Canada, and they have the broadcast license, and our supporter. We were supported by the CMF and Telefilm and Rogers and all of our supporters who made this possible, that a Canadian could do a story that no American would.
Yeah.
No one was wanting to do Jimmy Duncan's story. No one is still doing Jimmy Duncan's story because of the political pressure. And I can truly say that and he said, I wanted someone far enough away and who believed in things enough that they could get this done. And he says every day, I'm so glad I reached out to a Canadian, to do this. And so that, I'm really proud of, and glad that we have, the ability to do this kind of work in Canada, because it impacts everyone. So it will be early next year, probably, when it'll be available on Hollywood Suite. We're also talking to distributors, and hopefully another streamer for an international sales as well. So it'll be out there, but if anyone wants to have a justice screening, we're totally up for that.
Well, I can't wait to see the end result. I know both of you have put a lot of work and effort into it. And thank you so much for being interested in this subject. I know it means to you, Maria, personally, and Catherine, you've been working all your career about these issues, but it's really important to have people who talk about these issues and never give up, because they are unpopular. People don't want, like you said, in another wrongful conviction. And that's really the attitude that we don't want people to have. People should care more. And I really hope that with this documentary, people will see the importance of caring about these cases and being involved, and that hopefully it will create some kind of mind shift in the perception of these cases, because it's really sad when a person's life is lost, or like so many years of their lives are taken away because of a wrongful conviction.
Well,
So
that's why I'm so grateful to Maria for not
yeah.
only jumping in on a wacky phone call from a journalist she'd never met, and
On
immediately she
Mother's Day.
jumped in on Mother's, hey, would you like to, reroute your Mother's Day and come and do this strange thing that I want to do? And, she jumped in immediately, and there's a handful of people. For every no I got, there was a handful of people like Maria who were the yes, and I'm going to go through and credit all of them. But every single one of those people I've had a quiet moment with recently and said, this wouldn't have happened without you. And that is absolutely true. It was a series of individuals that made this happen. And I hope, as Maria's, hoping to do, to galvanize our Canadian justice community to make the most out of this film. It's entertaining, it's good, it's got alligators.
Yeah.
Like, there's all kinds of amazing stuff in here, that if we can, have a film like this and we can show it to the right audiences and really bring the right support and backing to it, of course we can make a difference. That's why I did it. So that's
Yeah.
the next step.
And for me, it's not about a case of of someone who's American. It's not about a case that's in the United States. It's about a human being.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and I will always do what I can to help as much as possible. So such an honor, Catherine.
Thank you.
The relationship that has blossomed with us as a result of filming this documentary is incredible. And I can't thank you enough for keeping me, in real time, especially during show cause hearings to get Jimmy out, how important that was. But again, both of you play a very important role in getting this message out. So thank you. Thank you for me.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, both of you, for being my guests today and for sharing your work. I feel very honored and privileged to have had that chat with you. And as I said, I can't wait to see the documentary because it's really very important. The message is important, the topic is important, and I'm sure a lot of people will connect with it, and hopefully a wider audience will understand the importance of these issues. So thank you so much. And I'm
Thank you.
hoping that I can chat with you again in the future, whether it's related to this topic or something else, but it's a pleasure to have had you as my guest today.
Thank you. We'll
Thanks
see
so
you at the
much.
screening.
Yes.
Bye bye.
Bye.